Hey everybody, checking in with a little bit more content from the content mines today out here on the big island of Hawaii. Obviously some of the news coming out of the Gang of Eight, the intelligence committees in the U.S. Congress related to potential new nuclear capabilities, nuclear space capabilities that may be possessed or are being actively researched by the Russian Federation. But Dan, you say you're not an expert in space or nukes or anything like that, and that's very true. I don't want to pretend to be. There's definitely better people for you to go to get information about the specifics of this capability, if it's an EMP weapon, if it's a targeted laser, if it's some other kind of bombardment technology, or if it's more akin to what Dr. Bleden Bowen at the University of Leicester has suggested, who is happens to be an expert on these kinds of space weapons, and they've noted that this could potentially be, very much overplayed and really nothing new and nothing to worry about. What I am more versed in, obviously, than the actual specific capabilities that the Russian Federation may or may not have with this recent launch, the Soyuz launch that's gotten all this attention, is actually the international agreement component of this debate. There's been a lot of discussion of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and how that does or does not impact Russia's behavior.
There is no immediate threat to anyone's safety.
National Security spokesman John Kirby said Thursday that the U.S. has been aware of Russia's pursuit of weapons technology in space for months. If developed and deployed, the weapon would be a violation of the Outer Space Treaty that Russia signed, which forbids the release of weapons of mass destruction in space.
And I just wanted to chime in with my thoughts on that because it actually relates quite a bit to videos I've made in the past about using sort of arms control frameworks to think about controlling AI technology and the researching of large language models. I'll link that video here for anyone that's interested. But as I mentioned, the broad strokes of the international reaction to this event related to a potential Russian nuclear weapon in space reminded me a bit of that AI video, in the sense that one of the immediate kind of refrains from the media and some of the outcry from sort of social media and traditional media has been, well, what about the Outer Space Treaty? What about arms control treaties that are intended to limit the use, or in the case of the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, completely prohibit the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in outer space.
According to U.S. intelligence, the weapon would be capable of destroying U.S. satellites, shutting down communication, surveillance programs, and possibly impacting military command operations.
And in that sense, I think the recommendation from sort of the international studies, international relations perspective is largely the same, right? That when you look at these, there are often people who will say these agreements aren't worth the paper that they're written on, and I actually tend to disagree with that. It's kind of a blithe way of critiquing international agreements, particularly around arms control, that does tend to bear out, obviously, right? These agreements are not written in stone and aren't actually binding, but when you find them to be effective, similar to the point I was making in the AI arms control video, really what you need to look at is the underlying state of the competitive game that's happening between the actors who signed these agreements, right? And in the case of the 1967 Space Treaty, what was really being agreed to was, this was, if you go back and look into this period of time, there was the Glassboro Summit, there was a lot of warming, it was a period of relative warming between the Johnson administration and the Soviet Union in particular that kind of was undergirding a lot of agreements around anti-ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in general. And there was an awareness, I think, on the part of both parties, perhaps for different reasons. There were just a lot of states that had a lot of concern and a lot of interest in further exploring the venue of outer space for communications technology, for intelligence technology, and there was a kind of a broad consensus that, similar to the earlier treaty on not weaponizing the exploration of Antarctica, there was an agreement that this should be sort of the property of all mankind. But that's all to say that it's not that a treaty like that is not worth the paper that it's written on. It just because Putin or anybody else wants to step away from it. What I think a better way to think about it is, when the interests of that state, continue to align with its previous interests, it's going to continue to abide by the norms and the regulations of a treaty like that. So it's not so much that it's useless; it's more that it's a particular historical artifact that is indicative of this particular dyad, this particular bilateral relationship between these two superpowers, these two nuclear armed powers at the time. And what was seen, from a security context at that point was, okay, weaponizing this venue actually, makes us all less safe because it actually hurts our ability to mutually assure one another's destruction. If we can't use satellite technology to identify first strike launches, it makes it more difficult for each party to understand and rely on the other to be prepared to do the same, to return nuclear weapons fire and create that equilibrium, that Nash equilibrium that would guarantee. I'm sorry, there's a dolphin jumping in the background there. That Nash equilibrium is really there to it exists as a point in the game state where both parties kind of see that they can't achieve any more of their interests without significantly raising the risks to themselves, and vice versa, right? And that sort of knowledge is explicitly understood between both parties. So that's really what birthed, at least in my opinion, these kinds of agreements, is further pursuing the weaponization of space, further pursuing certain types of missile technology. All it was doing was kind of spinning the wheels of both parties in this game, and they were already at a point where they knew that they both knew that they could mutually assure each other's destruction. So that's really what kind of created this treaty and what made it something that both parties adhered to. So who cares? What does this mean going forward? Well, I think what I would argue that it means going forward is that as long as that game state, as long as that end state is still how Putin sees this and how his coterie of advisors kind of see this game, we can be pretty assured that they're going to continue to play the game and as it's been played, and continue to ascribe to agreements like the Outer Space Treaty. Where we would want to be more concerned is if they've started to feel like, or this regime in the Russian Federation has started to feel like that treaty is limiting them in some way, or is actually creating more uncertainty for their national security than having it in place would entail. For example, if the conflict in Ukraine, that maybe the satellite technology that's been deployed there by the Ukrainians and the United States and the NATO countries, perhaps the Russian administration, the Russian regime is starting to see that technology as really debilitating to its efforts to promulgate that war of aggression. And if they really do see that war as integral to their national security, perhaps this has been raised, to the point where maybe the situation from their viewpoint has changed enough that this kind of escalation is warranted for their own interests. But that's really, I think the point I'm trying to make is that it's all about their interests. People, I think, often naively hold up these kinds of agreements and say, well, what about this agreement? This is against international law, which of course doesn't really matter. But I also don't think it's as easy as just dismissing anything written down, right? Saying, well, it's only worth the paper it's written on. That's not also really fair or accurate either. These treaties can be quite powerful normative instruments to constrain the behavior of states in the international system, but only when they correspond and continue to kind of align with underlying kind of game situations between two parties in the system. So I think the question we need to be asking ourselves here is, has the situation for the Russian Federation changed enough from that of the Soviet Union to warrant abandoning something like this and threatening to kind of elicit the responses from other parties that an escalation like putting a nuclear weapon in space would elicit from parties like the United States, the UK, NATO, probably many others as well. I happen to think that at this point those interests have not diverged enough to warrant something like this, in particular because I think Russia is still quite reliant upon GLONASS, upon GPS systems, and the utilization of, if this is a nuclear kind of EMP-based weapon, that would be too crude, too blunt a knife, perhaps too crude a tool to really do what they want to do with any kind of precision. It's possible with some other kind of targeted energy weapon. There's other things that people have considered. Again, I'm not going to go into too much speculation about that, but if it really is at the crux an issue of putting nuclear weapons into space and breaking that treaty, I think we can, at least at this point, understand this as more bluster and more threat than anything else. Could always be wrong. It's hard to, as we've seen with the Putin regime. You'll remember that in the run-up to the Ukraine war, the consensus among everybody, including Russians themselves, the Russian experts, experts in the region, was that Putin would be insane to initiate this conflict, and he would never do it. Obviously, that didn't prove to be the case. But in any case, I would say there's still a lot more to learn. We're still very much reading the tea leaves here, and there's a lot left to be revealed before we can really know what's going on. But I do think it's important to just say that if we believe that the sort of broad-based equilibrium between the Russian Federation and the United States hasn't changed, right, then it's unlikely that the Russian Federation would deploy something like this that would truly escalate and change the situation in that relationship. But as always, really curious what you guys think about the situation. Do you see Putin as being willing to break these norms and treaties and risk that kind of escalation to be able to hold sort of a sword over the West's satellite communications technology? Do you think he's there yet? Do you think this is all bluster as other things have been before with him and his regime? Definitely curious for your feedback in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.